Hey, welcome everyone to the STLE UK Student Chapter webinar on interview preparation and career development, which will be delivered by Professor Richard Boocock. Richard worked at Air Products and Chemicals for 39 years and has experience in almost every aspect of the industrial gases and hydrogen value chain across a wide range of geographies. He led, developed, and implemented a significant strategic global investment and transformation programs, both as a C-suite executive business leader and chief information officer. He has particularly deep experience in large asset-based businesses, developments in the Middle East and India. Richard holds an industrial chair of engineering leadership at the University of Birmingham, and he is a visiting fellow to the Dean's Office at Henley Business School. He is also a member of the Freedom of the Worshipful Company of Engineers and holds a number of board roles. Richard works as a freelance consultant, advising clients on a variety of topics, including hydrogen and hydrogen economy, the energy transition, digital transformation, sustainability, and technical innovation and commercialization. Thank you for joining us today, Richard, and over to you.
Pleasure. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Aida, for the wonderful introduction, very glowing introduction, and hopefully I can do it justice over the next few minutes. So thanks to everyone for joining the presentation. As hopefully we are showing the title slide, I put this together following a brief discussion, basically focused on career development, preparing for employment beyond academia. And I will qualify this as being a very personal view. Other people may have different opinions, but as someone who graduated from academia a long time ago and worked in industry, but recruited many people from different parts of academia, both bachelor's, master's, and PhD level employees, I'm presenting my own personal views here. So moving on to our content. What I'm going to cover is I'm going to cover a personal introduction about me, a brief summary of my career, the importance, in my opinion, of starting with your own self-assessment, understanding who you are, some tips around choosing an employer, some suggestions on CVs and cover letters, and some suggestions on interview preparation. Some comments on building a career, some closing thoughts, and most importantly, a question and answer period. The question and answer is really down to you. I would always say, as I always say, there is no question that you cannot ask. So don't feel that your question is either a silly question or a stupid question or a simple question. It's quite often those questions that are the ones that are in everybody's heads, and they want them to be asked. So please, this is a very safe environment. There's no judgment at all. Please ask whatever you want. So, moving on to my personal introduction. I was born in a place called Nelson in Lancashire, in England, in 1961. So that was quite a long time ago. And to give you an idea, Nelson in Lancashire is a very traditional Northern English town that grew up in the time of the Industrial Revolution. And the main industry there was cotton weaving, cotton spinning and cotton weaving. So very much a kind of industrial type location. Small town, population of 30,000 people. I had and have an elder brother and a younger sister. For me, my parents didn't go to university. My mother left school at 14. She went off to work in a shop. My father left school at 16, worked in a cinema, then went off to do his national service, which was a requirement in those days in the UK. And then he worked in a shop. And I worked in the shop at weekends and school holidays and got a lot of valuable skills from doing that. I went to local schools, primary and secondary schools in what in England or in the UK is called the comprehensive education system, which meant that I had to leave school at 16 and go to a sixth form college to do my A-levels. I got into studying chemical engineering at the University of Birmingham starting in 1979. And during that time, I secured a small sponsorship from a company called Courtaulds, a synthetic fiber company, which offered summer work placements and ultimately offered me a job, which I declined. And we'll perhaps have an opportunity to talk about that later in the presentation. I graduated in 1982 with a first-class honours in a Bachelor of Science, first-class honours in chemical engineering, and I joined a company called Air Products and Chemicals, which is still around today. a world-leading industrial gases company, is listed on the New York Stock Exchange if you want to go looking for it. I joined on their graduate development program in 1982, and then I basically retired in 2021, retiring for what in business circles is described as a C-level position. So I was one of the senior executives at the company, probably in the top six of the company after almost 39 years. I now work as a freelance consultant as an industrial professor at the University of Birmingham. I work at Birmingham 1 day per week, basically doing whatever people ask me to do. But one of the ways that I like to put it is my focus is on doing what I can to help create the next generation of engineers. Engineering has been good to me in terms of my career and my life, and I think it offers great opportunities to many people, and it will be engineers that solve the challenges that the world is facing today. In terms of my career, when I graduated in 1982 and I joined Air Products, I worked as an engineer for about my first 8 or so years. And as you always do as an engineer, is you work in multidisciplinary teams. As I always put it, as an engineer, you very rarely work alone. And I worked in research and development. I worked in design. I constructed facilities, operated facilities, improved them, automated them, did all sorts of things. After 8 or so years, I moved into more business and functional related roles. For me, as I was working as an engineer, and I'm very proud of being an engineer, and I still put on my various official forms that I'm a chemical engineer. If I'm applying for a visa and it says profession, I always say chemical engineer. But one of the things I found after 8 or so years is I was actually enjoying interacting with customers, um, um, perhaps a little more than doing the engineering. And so I moved into a business role, a sales role, and then progressed through the organization, undertaking a number of roles, including managing global research and development for Air Products at one stage, but always using my engineering training and gaining seniority and responsibility through the years. It also included some business change roles and even on a couple of occasions running the IT organization for the company. So for me, great examples of how engineering training provides a great platform or foundation for a varied career. Along the way, I gained chartered engineer status, member of the Institution of Chemical Engineers, which then led to a fellowship of the Institution of Chemical Engineers. And I also got an MBA from Henley Business School. And one of the things I always emphasize when you're thinking about your career is recognize that continuous learning and development is basically a requirement. I always like to put it when I do my presentations at University Open Days or School of Engineering Open Days here at Birmingham. I started my career before the PC was invented. The internet was a thing. The internet was not a thing when I started work. And then one of my final projects before I retired was implementing artificial intelligence in our manufacturing facilities around the world, all over the world, and using that to improve the performance of our facilities, the consistency of production, quantity of output, quality of output, and so on and so forth. So one of the things you should always consider as you look at your career is what are the opportunities and what are the needs for you to learn and develop as you go. And, perhaps a hint for one of the future slides is looking at companies on the basis of, is this a company that is going to support my development, or do they just want to employ me to do a job? That's a very important question. During my career, I lived in 3 different countries. I visited and worked in more than 40, worked with thousands of people of all faiths, ethnicities, and backgrounds. And, that was something that I really loved, getting out there to work with new people in different locations and recognizing that as human beings, we are all pretty much the same in many regards. So one of the ways I always like to summarize my career is I actually worked for the same company for almost 39 years, but I never actually held down a job for more than 4. And I was very fortunate with their products. They're a vertically integrated company, so they have lots of different things that are going in within the same company. And if you want to, you can go and experience all those different things, which is what I did. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm now semi-retired, working as an industrial professor at the University of Birmingham and a freelance consultant. So this is I've got a couple of pictures here of just to put into perspective what I was doing towards the end of my career. This is a hydrogen and carbon monoxide production facility in southwestern India, in Kochi, in Kerala. It supplies a oil refinery and a petrochemical complex. And one of my jobs was basically developing these types of supply solutions for customers like BPCL, the owner of the refinery down in Kochi, and negotiating contracts, getting the plant built, and then operating it on a long-term basis, 15 to 20 years. This is about a $600 million investment, so it's a fairly sizable investment. And as you can see just from the picture, there's quite a lot of things going on there. And this was one of my other final projects. This is the facility in Jazan in Saudi Arabia, southwestern Saudi Arabia. This one actually supplies a refinery owned by Saudi Aramco. And this investment was over $2 billion. And very proud of being involved in this project. It was constructed on time, on budget, and worked very and worked very nicely, and had the opportunity to work with a great team of people. So I'm now going to link back to that slide where I gave you my personal introduction. And you may have been surprised why I shared, some personal information in terms of, what my parents did and whether they went to university or not, and, my own education and so on and so forth. My reason for sharing that, and I'm not suggesting that you have to share your personal history publicly at any time, but it helped me in terms of understanding where I came from in my assessment of myself, in understanding who I am, and basically getting better at practicing self-reflection. And so, as you can see from the first bullet point, one of the things I wish I'd started earlier in my life and career was actually spending time to understand myself, practicing self-reflection, because in my opinion, this is really important when you get round to considering jobs of any type, careers and employers and so on and so forth. And so the questions that I'd encourage you to ask yourself as you look at, look at applying for jobs and selecting companies to apply for, is thinking about what are your values? What's more or less important to you? What are your strengths? What are your preferences? What are your development needs? What do you dislike doing? And when you think about work-life balance, what does that look like to you? You see a lot of things, I see a lot of things in the business press, in academic articles, business school articles, and social media about the importance of work-life balance. And it's often presented as though there's a single version of work-life balance that everyone should comply with or conform to. I have a very different opinion. I enjoyed my work. I enjoyed working hard. I enjoyed accomplishing things with people. My balance point between my work and my non-work life, if it's actually possible to discriminate that, would probably look quite different to other people. And that's okay. It's not that they're right and I'm wrong, or vice versa. It's just that this is a very important element of understanding who you are, what you're about, what's important to you, and therefore making sure that you're looking at employers and jobs and careers that will enable you to be as successful as possible and hopefully as happy as possible. How ambitious are you? Is recognition important to you? And what does that look like? What do you think you can contribute to an organization? I'll give you a simple example in terms of recognition and its importance to people. When I was working in the corporate world, we had a lot of people in our office, and we were running out of space in the car park. And there were, for people of a certain grade, there were reserved car parking spaces. So if you were a senior manager, you had a reserved parking space. But of course, the senior managers weren't always in the office, so quite often their parking spaces were empty while everyone else was having difficulty finding somewhere to park. So a decision was made by the company that they would basically get rid of the reserved car parking spaces. For me, that was kind of a shrug of my shoulders because I'm not the sort of person that goes around thinking I need to have a reserved car parking space. But for one of my colleagues, it was actually quite a traumatic decision because one of the things I came to appreciate with him, very nice guy, very professional, very good at his job. But for him, one of the things that was really important to him was having that recognition and visible recognition that said he's a senior manager. So having a better quality office than other people, having the reserved car parking space are very visible, manifestations of what he considered to be his success. And it took him quite some time to come to terms with the fact that he was no longer going to have a reserved car parking space. Now, you might think that is a, bit of a silly example in some regards, but it is a real example. And it's one of the things to think about. To me, it was a really good example of really thinking about, what are the things that are important to me and also acknowledging that what's important to me may not be important to other people and vice versa. Thinking about what you can contribute to an organization is really important, especially if you a postgraduate, if you're pursuing a postgraduate qualification and you're positioning yourself to apply to a company, thinking through, what value can I bring to that organization? How would they perceive me? And we'll talk about that in a couple of slides time. And if you look at a summary of your qualifications, but you also add on to that, what are your skills and your contributions look like? What does that tell you about yourself in terms of what's important to you and what you're good at? And by going through this fairly simple process, you can start to, one suggestion I would make is to kind of visualize in your mind, just like Olympic athletes visualize running down the track, long before they start running down the track, they actually sit and visualize what a successful world-beating run down the track actually looks like. And so something I try and practice, and I would encourage you to try it as well, is just sitting there and visualizing what does an ideal day or week or month or year in a workplace that you're in, what might that look like? How does the day start? How does the day continue? What are the types of activities that you're doing? What are the things that you would look for? Because knowing that will be very important for you when you start looking at what type of company do I want to apply to and what type of job. Which leads us neatly onto choosing an employer, which may seem a bit of a strange thing to say because obviously when you're applying for a job, there's a very strong sense that an employer is choosing you. But one of the things I would always encourage people, especially coming from an engineering background, is that, in most parts of the world, we continue to have a shortage of engineers. And so, you should recognize that, that there's not a huge surplus of engineers. Yes, companies may be a little choosy in terms of who they recruit, but you do have a choice. And it's never too early to start thinking about and researching companies. Again, taking that element of what is important to you. Because employers are looking for mutual attraction. So make sure that you know what you are looking for in a company. I mean, to give you some, quantifiable examples, when I was working in industry and we were recruiting people, if you costed out the activities associated with recruiting people, there's probably some, depending on the complexity of the recruitment and the type of role that you're recruiting for. Recruiting someone costs anything from $10,000 to $100,000. So you can imagine that companies are not looking to recruit people who don't fit and then leave. So companies from the beginning, good companies, in my opinion, are looking for mutual attraction. They want to satisfy themselves during the interview and selection process that this is a person that's applied to this job that will be a good fit for our organization and will be able to make a contribution to our organization. But also, we are a company that we think this person would feel comfortable at, and so therefore we stand a decent chance of retaining them. I'll give you a simple example. I won't name the person, but one of my ex-colleagues that I worked with some years ago, he hasn't retired, he's still working. He posted on LinkedIn a couple of months ago that he had started a new job with an employer. And this morning I saw that he posted another update on his LinkedIn profile saying, I've now left this employer because after 2 months I figured out that this wasn't a place where I could be successful. This particular gentleman's a very bright guy, but he, in my opinion, didn't take that step of actually doing a bit more research up front in terms of what does this company actually stand for, and is this a company where I can feel comfortable, and because I feel comfortable, I can be successful. There's got to be some sort of, consistency in terms of that mutual attraction. Think about your values and priorities and map them against potential employers. This can be as simple as, are there particular industries that you don't want to work in? When I was starting to look for jobs in the early 80s, I was a little bit of an environmentalist, and I was also a bit of a pacifist and an anti-nuclear person. And so I decided not to apply to nuclear companies. In today's world, given the part that nuclear can play in terms of carbon-free energy, I would probably have a different view. But at that time, one of my values was I didn't want to work for military companies or armaments companies. I didn't want to work for nuclear companies. So, think about your values and priorities and map them against potential employers. The other thing to do is to do your research. Read annual reports. Most companies will have some sort of material out there, especially larger companies who will be listed on the stock exchange. If you go to their websites, you'll usually find a tab that's called Investor Relations. And for listed companies, Investor Relations has obligations, legal obligations for them to present their annual reports, their sustainability reports, and so on and so forth. Look at their LinkedIn content. What are they talking about on LinkedIn? Is that something that attracts you, or is it something that repels you? Their social media content, press releases, and if you have the opportunity to see them, representatives of the company present at conferences, then, how does that come across? Do you like what you see? Also, I should say, when you do this research, it's also a very good source of questions for when you get to an interview. Because as someone who's interviewed many people, one of the things I really don't like is when I get to the part of saying, and do you have any questions? The response I get is, no, I don't have any questions. Because there must be some questions in a candidate's head. Attend networking events and talk to people, depending on the area that you're in. Obviously, we're talking here with a society or a professional association here with people with common interest. Attend networking events that they hold. Talk to people, make connections with people at companies that you might be interested in. Ask them what it's like to work there. Get a kind of, just get that personal view. As I say, industry and professional associations and conferences are great places to network. And the final point on this is, if you don't like what you see, then why would you apply for a job there? And this is where there's a little bit of a sting in the tail of that point. You may actually want to apply, or you may need to apply to a company where you actually don't like what you see, but you may have reasons for doing that. You may have reasons to get a job as quickly as possible. You may need to get some money, and they're offering a role that pays particularly well. So even if you don't like the company, there may be reasons that you apply for a job there, but make sure you remember the reasons why and how you feel about that company. There's nothing wrong with joining a company for your own purposes and for your own needs. And then when you've satisfied those needs, like you've made a bit of money over the first couple of years and you've got something impressive on your resume, if you don't feel you can work at that company long term, then after a couple of years, that's a very credible time to leave. So be confident about you having the responsibility to manage your career. It isn't someone else's job. You manage your career. Some suggestions that I dropped in here for postgraduates is really to think about how an employer may perceive your postgraduate qualification. Many employers will be recruiting a mix of bachelor's, master's, and perhaps some PhDs. And so thinking about what is the value that you bring to that organization and how that value is perceived, because a value is also always something that the person on the other side of the table is perceiving. You may have something that you think is valuable, but if they don't see it as valuable, then it isn't. So, for example, from a postgraduate standpoint, you may bring specific technical know-how in an area that's directly relevant to their business. And they may look at you as someone who's got really good specific technical knowledge, and you could be an accelerator for them in terms of solving a problem. You may be in a situation where, your experience of structured research and investigation is something that the company values, but you did your research in a technical area that maybe isn't relevant to that company. There's still value that you bring there in terms of if they have a problem that they need to get solved and they're looking for someone with research experience to take a structured approach to solving that problem, then you would still have some value to offer. And of course, you could indicate that experience by something that you demonstrate as an individual or as a leader or member of a research group. You may be bringing additional skills and maturity in the organization, right? So when I was involved in recruitment, we may sometimes have what are called assessment centers where people come in and we give them, we interview them, we give them problems to solve, group work, and so on and so forth. And quite often, one of the things that we found with the PhD applicants is that, they just had a bit more maturity about them. One, they're older, typically. Without getting into an ageist discussion, typically PhDs are older, they're perhaps a little more mature, they have a little bit more life experience, and they perhaps acquired some additional skills compared to bachelor's and master's candidates. And so that in itself can be something that sets you apart. One of the things that is important to remember is that you may be presented with situations where employers say, well, we'd like to give you a job, but we actually can't pay you any more money just because you have a PhD. We know you spent 3 or 4 years working on it, but this is our starting salary. It's really down to you as to whether you feel okay with that, whether you see potential in the company in terms of progression, because very few good people, when they start with a company, very few will stay on their starting salary for very long. And if you have more skills and capabilities, then that will support your progression through the company. Another thing to look for, especially if you're coming at it from a postgraduate standpoint, is does the employer's career development structure support different aspirations? So the company I worked for, because we had always had a very long history of technical excellence, we actually had career ladders, career programs that would reflect technical excellence and technical capability and reward people for that. As well as having a development ladder for people that were more focused on the management side of things. So one of the things you may have come across or may not have come across is in many companies, jobs are assessed on the basis of what's called the size of the job. And the things that influence the size of the job are often the number of people that you manage or the size of a business, the business revenue that you manage. Now, as you can imagine, if you're working in a research and development environment, you may not be managing very many people, and you may certainly not be managing a lot of revenue for the company. So in companies like mine, we put this what's so-called technical ladder in place back in the 1970s when we recognized that we need to have something different to people who were pursuing technical excellence in a company rather than pursuing management development. And so a good question to ask when you're heading to an interview in terms of do companies have a separate development ladder for technologies if that's the type of job that you want to get into. Some suggestions on CVs and cover letters. Make sure you're always looking at building your resume and your CV. What are the experiences that you have? What are the skills? Resist the temptation to exaggerate because that comes undone quite quickly. Be factual, be honest, be positive and confident, but don't exaggerate. Include relevant experience, not just academic related. Remember that companies are recruiting people not just on the basis of their qualifications, but on their skills and what they actually bring into the organization. And so therefore talk about your accomplishments and skills, not just positions and roles. Uh, Employers are much more interested in delivery of outcomes rather than job titles. Job titles change from one company to another. You could be called a senior vice president in some companies and have only one person reporting to you and annual sales of 100,000 pounds. And you could be called, senior engineer in another company, have much bigger responsibility. So what employers want to do is they want to hear about what are the things that you delivered and quantify them whenever you can. How many new products have you developed? How many patents have you filed? As a result of your work, how much costs was saved in a manufacturing process? How much energy was saved in a manufacturing process? To what extent have you been able to, drive sustainability measures in a positive manner, and so on and so forth? So always think about how do I actually quantify the value of my work, and that doesn't always have to be financial value, but it certainly helps. The other thing is, don't worry if your resume or CV isn't very long. Employers know that you're starting out. Again, I've seen resumes over the years where someone who's leaving university or perhaps 1 or 2 years out of university has tried to basically pad out their resume through some exaggeration, and it does ultimately it actually dilutes the value and the impact of their experience. In today's world, many companies are using AI tools to scan applications. So research the keywords that make the difference. And places like LinkedIn and other websites out there will actually give you the opportunity to scan your CV through a device, through a software that would actually scan your application and give you some suggestions in terms of how to improve it. The other thing I would say is keep your resume crisp. A couple of sides of A4 is more than enough, in my opinion. And to use a modern expression, avoid the unspoken, too long didn't read response. Believe it or not, I've actually been given resumes in the past that went to 20 pages of A4. That's almost a day-by-day diary of somebody's life as opposed to a resume. So, yeah, couple of sides of A4. My personal resume, after working for over 40 years, it's probably a page and a half of A4 text. Some suggestions on interview preparation. For interviews, prepare. Write down your list of questions that you've researched for the company, and if you can, practice them with a friend or family members. Don't be afraid of actually taking a piece of paper in your pocket or in your bag, and when you get to the questions part of the interview, saying, I do have some questions and I wrote them down so I wouldn't forget them. Would you mind if I got this piece of paper out? Or if you've saved it on your phone, put a little note onto your phone. Just say, do you mind if I look at my phone and look at the questions? It indicates to the interviewer that, one, you were polite, and two, that you did some preparation and you've been thinking about questions in advance. When you come around to answering the questions that are asked of you, for technical questions, you will often, if you're applying for an engineering role, you'll be presented with a scenario or problem and asked how you would approach investigating it. No one is expecting you to come out with the right answer. What they are expecting you to do is not to stop with just one approach, right? So when you're presented with the problem and you'll have a few minutes to kind of noodle through, okay, what am I looking at? What's the issue? Don't develop an approach, but then also come up with another idea. Try and give a second or perhaps even a third alternative approach, because in the world of work, when you're presented with a problem, there is rarely only one solution. There are usually multiple solutions of varying potential of success, varying cost, varying complexity, and that's what employers will be looking for. In terms of non-technical, you may be presented with a scenario relating to interacting with people or a team. A very common question is things like, how do you deal with conflict? Or you're in a situation where you have a disagreement over the direction that a project or a technical team is taking. How do you deal with that? My recommendation, try to include examples from your experience. And it doesn't have to be technical experience. A couple of students in the last year or so, I was coaching them, and when they were expressing their concerns that they may not have experience in dealing with conflict, I asked one of them what he did, because I knew he was working part-time. What do you do? And he said, well, I work at a restaurant. I said, okay, so how often do you have an unhappy customer? And he said, well, every night. There's always someone that's complaining about something. So there you go. Great material. Don't feel that you have to just talk about either your experience at a university, or your experience in working in industry, dealing with conflict in your personal life, part-time jobs, if you're a member of a golf club or a netball team or something like that. These are all good experiences. The interviewers are looking for you to be able to talk about how you approach those types of challenges. In terms of in-person interviews, and again, this is where I put the qualification on the title page that this is a personal view. In my view, it is important to find out what is the dress code for an organization. And don't be afraid to ask. If you're invited to an interview in person, or perhaps to an assessment center that's going to be, an afternoon, an overnight stay, and then continuing the following day, whoever it is that's sending you the invitation, don't be afraid to ask them, is there a dress code for your organization? Or look at their website and see what people look like. What you don't want to do is to turn up in jeans and t-shirts and sneakers when everyone else is, in relatively smart business attire. If in doubt, pitch for the middle ground. Go in what many people would refer to as business casual. Smartly presented. But don't feel that you have to be overdressed, but avoid being underdressed, because those first impressions, whether we like it or not, they do count. For me, again, one of my obsessions is make sure you know where you're going and get there early. There's always a place to stop and sit for a cup of coffee and to catch up on your email. And if you're going to an office which is perhaps in a more remote location, if you get there, 45 minutes early, there's always going to be a place for you to sit, and they will think positively about you, taking them seriously and respecting them and getting there nice and early in time for so that you're ready for the interview. Not a good idea to turn up in a hot and sweaty mess, because you cut things too fine. And as I said, make sure you have those questions ready. One of the things you'll often be presented with is doing group exercises. And he is, as someone who's done lots of ratings of people in group exercises, it's important to kind of think through and read through, what are the options for behaving in terms of these group scenarios. First of all, I would say don't feel that you have to be the leader, but if your group is directionless, then step up and lead, but don't dominate. There's very big marks usually for people that bring other team members into the discussion. People, on the other hand, who dominate the conversation and just talk all the time and talk over other people, they probably wouldn't be getting a job, not in my organization. Use positive reinforcing vocabulary. What do I mean by that? Don't tell someone that their suggestion is a stupid idea, right? Tell someone that, okay, that's a great idea, but I think it will be even better if ... And if nothing else, engage and participate. Be confident, humble, and inclusive. Employers won't be attracted to people that are talking all the time and dominating the conversation, but they also won't be attracted to people who just sit there and say nothing and don't engage in the activity. In terms of building a career, and we're getting close to the end of my slides, so get ready for your questions. Some tips on building a career. In most roles, less than 6 months after you start work, very few people will care what sort of degree or what class of degree you got. In some very specialized research environments, that may continue to be relevant for longer. But once in an organization, you're very much measured on what and how you deliver to the company objectives. And that's the reality. It's all about, I got a first. I'm very proud of my first. I worked with people who got 2 1s, 2 2s, and thirds. And within 6 months, no one was talking about, well, Richard's really clever because he got a first. It's all about, what is Richard delivering? How does he deliver it? Is he meeting expectations in terms of his performance? And many of my colleagues that got 2 2s and thirds were doing just as well, believe me. If you move companies, you may get to dust off your certificate very briefly, but be realistic about what it is that matters when you move into a business environment. Building a career is a balance. What can you give to the organization that you joined, and what can you get from the organization that you joined? And it's very important, that second bullet point, recognize that you are there to get something. It's not all about the company that you're working for. It's about what can you get to help deliver your career. Understand in each company what it takes to get ahead and what are the characteristics and behaviors that influence progression or not. And if you're finding that that's not a fit for you, then it's probably a good time to leave and use your experience to go and get another job. Be objective, or perhaps even ruthless. Every couple of years, make an assessment of whether you're getting what you want and whether future options will meet your needs. I used to do this every couple of years, typically after Christmas, because I was at home and I had a glass of wine or something like that, and just scribble down on a piece of paper, what am I getting for the company? What do I want? What does my medium-term future look like? Should I stay or should I go? And as you can tell, I stayed for 39 years. But that doesn't mean to say that I didn't come close to going at various times in the 39 years. So yeah, make sure that you always remind yourself that you are there to develop your career as well as support the company in its objectives. Continue to network internally and externally, and being a member of a professional association is a great way to do it. Find ways to get to conferences, whether your employer will support it or not. You don't need to go to a conference every week. You don't need to go to more than 1 or 2 conferences every year, in my opinion. But make sure that you recognize that networking is part of your work in developing your career. And for me, one of the things that I look back on, again, very personal view, don't be afraid to take a chance on an assignment that lots of other people are running away from. Sometimes it's when you do something different and a little bit risky that it gets you noticed. And if you are successful in what you take on, then you may get more responsibilities and advancement in the organization as a consequence. So my closing thoughts before we launch into all those questions that you've saved up for me is first of all, in the current situation, which I know is difficult, out there, but don't panic is my recommendation. I know it's easy to say, less easy to do, but if you don't immediately get a job or you don't get an interview, focus on getting the best, whether you're an undergraduate, whether you're a master's, or whether you're doing your PhD, focus on getting the best outcome that you possibly can. One of the things that companies recognize is that many people take a break after academia at whatever level. They take a year out. So you can take a year out, you can do something meaningful and join the rat race a little later. And companies will not think badly of you for doing that. In fact, the company I worked for, one of the things that we asked people if we were going to give them an offer is we would ask them, as they were approaching graduation or leaving university, we would ask them, are you thinking of doing some traveling? And if they said, well, yeah, kind of, then we'd say, well, why don't you take a year to go traveling? We'll give you a job offer, but we'll date it 12 months in the future. So you can go off and enjoy yourself. You can scratch that itch of global travel, and then you can come back, walk into a job with a known salary, and build your career from there. Because one of the things that we had found, and this goes back to how much it costs to recruit people, one of the things we found is if we weren't probing for that type of interest, we had people who were joining us straight from university, and then after 6 to 12 months, they quit because they wanted to go traveling and they realized that they needed to scratch that itch before they settled down. So don't be afraid of taking a bit of a year out. Of course, there are financial considerations, and that's everyone's personal assessment there. In the current situation, a lot of uncertainty in the world with wars and changing policies, volatile conditions. Is AI going to replace everyone or not? It isn't, in my opinion. But what do companies do in these circumstances? They wait. They just don't make a decision. And so one of the things to be prepared for is that things may be a little slow, but don't worry, at some stage, companies will recognize that actually they do need to fill that position and they are going to recruit someone for it. It's important to take a medium-term view. So if you can't or don't get the job that you want, Look for ways to get other experiences and skills. Do some volunteering work. Take another type of job that helps build your skills. Travel. Bigger companies are used to people wanting to travel, as I've said. And stay positive, stay confident, which can be difficult, but your job is to stay confident. And remember, it's about skills and experiences. Companies aren't necessarily looking for you to go off and find a highly technical job as a continuation of your academic activity. What they're not expecting you to do, if you don't mind me putting it this way, is to kind of sit on the sofa watching daytime television instead of getting out there and finding ways to get new experience and new skills, as I say, even on a voluntary basis.